With the conclusion of Trails in the Sky first chapter thoroughly gripping me, I immediately went on to play Trails in the Sky second chapter, the sequel, with very, very high hopes. Though I wasn't naive in my expectations for the game, because of course, I've acknowledged the faults and flaws of Trails in the Sky first chapter. If you wish to know my thoughts on that, there is a video that will be linked in the top right. And, well, simply to say, I was not disappointed by second chapter. All around, I think it is a much better game than the first, though one that cannot exist without it. Gameplay-wise, it's an all-round improvement. Even though very little changes, it just feels less clunky, and the story and pacing are much, much more engaging. Speaking of which, with that generalization out of the way, let's go in and talk about things in a bit more detail, shall we? So let's start with the gameplay, just to avoid spoilers for those of you that might not have played it and might not have played Trails in the Sky first chapter and are for some reason watching this. Weird. I mean, if you haven't played either, I recommend them, genuinely. Although maybe try Trails of Cold Steel first to see if you enjoy the general style, and then from there, go back. Just my input. Anyway. So, second chapter. Gameplay-wise, as I said, is an all-round improvement. Part of the reason for this is because of how much stronger the cast is in this game compared to the first one. In Trails in the Sky first chapter, fights kind of dragged. They felt like a bit of a slog, especially in the especially toward probably like late mid-game. Until like the end game, most fights felt really, really slow, and certain fights in the end game also felt incredibly slow. Whereas in Sky Second, the fights are a lot faster, especially against random mob encounters. Those you can clear out in like 1 or 2 attacks compared to first chapter where it'll take you 4 or 5 turns, which, you know, isn't ideal for grinding. However, because I like to do that, even though these games don't really encourage it, but, you know, it's just how I am. Mainly for Sepith, really. As I was saying, fights are a lot faster paced. And this makes them, in my opinion, more enjoyable. It makes the gameplay a little bit less clunky as well. There's also an expansion of the arts. There are more spells in the game because, well, in Sky 1, there's like 2 mirage spells, like 2 space spells, and time had a fair few because, well, it had to, otherwise Joshua would be useless in the first game, at least from a spell front. Well, not completely, but you get what I'm saying. So they expand the spell list, which I think it was a good decision. Not that space, time, and mirage spells have an impact in the gameplay, at least not that I'm aware of. I don't think any enemies were weak to them. At least the game did display it. And typically it does, as it does in Cold Steel, when enemies become weak to them, as opposed to when they're not. Although, entirely a separate point. Crafts as well, your crafts become much stronger. You have viable AoE options for your crafts, especially at a certain point when you get a certain character in your party. You know who I'm on about, whose S-craft is full screen. It's so good to have. Genuinely, the gameplay feels much, much better to play than first chapters did. That's really all there is to it. As for going around, the gameplay outside of combat for the chapters and such, again, all around better. There's only one chapter that I think was unnecessary, boring even, and that's chapter 8. If you've played the games, you know, but we'll talk about it in more detail a bit later on. I didn't find chapter 8 all that engaging. There's only a few things you have to do other than just walk around the entire, all of Laberle, and then you're done. It was not a very long chapter and not a very engaging one, if I'm being entirely honest, but maybe that's just me. I'm sure some people would have liked it. I like it from a storytelling perspective, but not from a gameplay perspective. It's probably the way I should frame that. Yeah, that's a fair framing of it. Is gameplay-wise, it's not very interesting, but story-wise, I quite like it. Speaking of gameplay, the final boss, because I did bring up the final boss of first chapter briefly in that video. Well, in this game, the final boss is an absolute joke. Like, if I'm being totally honest, the final boss in this game is a complete pushover. Arguably, the boss before the final boss is the harder one. Actually, no, the one 2 fights before, not the one before. 2 fights before the final boss is arguably the hardest fight in the game. The final boss was a complete joke. All 3 phases were a complete cakewalk. I don't know whether that's intentional. Maybe I just because I understood the augment setup a bit more this game than I did the previous one, because I'll be entirely honest, I did not properly invest into my augments in the first game. I'm looking at my stealth setup, I'm like, what the fuck was I doing? The only character that had a proper setup was Joshua, but that's irrelevant here. In this game, every character had a proper setup. So maybe that's why. But I found, difficulty-wise, this game was probably easier, again, for the same reasons I said earlier. If your characters are stronger, you have more options because the spell list is more expanded. So it feels easier from that regard. Though there were certain fights that, again, do feel like utter bullshit. Like, there's one fight that just... the boss has AoE attacks and has a chance to just inflict AoE, instant death on any of their attacks to any of your party members. So, if you get unlucky, that fight will just be a nightmare. And it was a small nightmare for me, but that's by the by. That fight, it's not meant... it's just not fair. I mean, you can equip death-resistant gear, but shut up. Shut up. How are you meant to know that they're going to inflict instant death on you, potentially inflict instant death on you in every attack, right? Leave me alone. Although, it would be a wise decision, given a lot of enemies can just inflict instant death out of nowhere, so... And you do get 2 Grail Lockets, so 2 of your characters can be immune to it, but... Enough of that, right? Enough of that. Let's talk about the story. So, spoilers. I will say this here, spoilers for both first and second chapter. Bear that in mind. So, the prologue. Way, way better than first chapter's prologue. First chapter's prologue is incredibly, incredibly slow. Second chapter's gets you into the action, gets you hooked, it sets everything up, it reintroduces, Estelle and her motive and what she's doing. It just, it's handled brilliantly. It introduces you to Kevin really early on, and the training camp bit, brilliant. It gets the tempo going really quickly right from the get-go, which is really, really good, and that's what I think first chapter lacked in. Although first chapter has a reason for why it can't really do that, and, well, it's got to set up a hell of a lot more. It needs to be slower, and I said that in that video, but second chapter can go and just go. I do think Cold Steel 1's prologue is probably the most engaging because of it using Medea's res, but topic for another day. Again, the prologue, much more engaging, sets up brilliantly, it just gets you in, it gets you going, and I really enjoyed it. Chapter 1. What is Chapter 1? You're in Grand Soul in Chapter 1, aren't you? There's a lot more chapters in this game as well, which is one thing I should point out. So each chapter is all around shorter, but there are more of them. And I think I prefer that style because at some certain points, certain chapters in first felt a bit slow, they were dragged out. Whereas in second, each chapter is paced much better because they're shorter and there's more of them. So you get in, you get your stuff done, you get out and you move in. You're constantly flowing, you're constantly moving. There's not as much dead time as I felt like there was in first chapter. So yeah, all around great stuff. Really enjoyed the adjustments to the pacing. I'm probably not going to do a breakdown of each chapter because, as I've already realized, I don't really remember what happened in chapter 1. I do remember generally the arc of the game. And I guess that brings us on to the primary focus of second chapter, at least for the majority of it. And that is Estelle Bright and her growth. Her striving to become someone that can protect and, get what she wants. And that is bringing Joshua back. She has to grow a hell of a lot to be able to achieve that. And she does. Her growth in this game is really, really good. She goes from this naive, young girl who has no idea about the greater world, and then after the crushing blow dealt to her at the end of the first chapter, gets her wake-up call. She changes her outlook. She starts to really apply herself, and she goes, in terms of her skills, is leaps and bounds above where she was in first chapter. But as a person, she's developed a hell of a lot. She's able to, bring Joshua back for one, and while she doesn't successfully convince Renee to leave Ouroboros, she clearly lays the seeds that I feel like will ultimately be sown in a later game. So I really look forward to seeing that, as I expect, will happen. I mean, I know it will happen. I've seen that Renee is in Cold Steel 3, 4, and Reverie, so I know it happens. Mild spoilers by just knowledge of the other games, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. It won't take away from the moment for me. But yes, bringing Joshua back at the end was such a great scene. In fact, I'll tell you one of my favorite scenes in the game. Chapter 4, I think it was, when you're in Roland. Right at the end, after the dream sequence, that Luciola, I think, I don't know how you say her name, puts you into after her fight. Well, her fight. The fight against the two spooky smoke demons. The scene with Estelle's mother, right at the end, got me tearing up. That scene's so good. That scene is absolutely incredible. It's beautiful. Genuinely. That's a... oh my god. A beautiful scene. It was fantastic. I loved it. Genuinely. It was so good. It warmed my heart, tugged at my heartstrings. You know, all those buzzwords for saying it was very emotional, and I enjoyed it. But yeah, it got me tearing up, and that don't happen very often. I'll tell you now. I don't tear up often in games, but that was a really good moment, really good scene. And then we get to, well, Joshua and his resolution being, you know, fighting against Laue and fully freeing himself from Wiseman and Ouroboros' grip, which I think was really cool. It was a really cool moment. Obviously, thanks to Kevin, it's capable of happening, and I actually quite like Kevin as a character. He's this goofy, quirky little guy that is way bigger and way more important and, you know, powerful than he could ever have let on during the game, being a Gralsritter. You know, one of the upper echelons of the Septian Church, a mysterious a mysterious entity that we don't really know a whole lot about, although having started the chapter, I'm starting to get little drops here and there. Obviously, I will do a video on third chapter when we get there. But yes, Joshua finally freeing himself, you know, not running away from his past, his darkness. Brilliant. Really good stuff. And Laue, what a guy, man. What a guy. I knew he wasn't evil. I knew he was better than that. I knew it. I called it. I mean, it wasn't surprising, but what a guy. Rest in peace. You will be missed. Enforcer number 4. I think it was 4. Blade Lord. You will be missed. Speaking of Ouroboros, probably my biggest gripe with second chapter is it doesn't really make the Enforcers feel all that powerful. The only one that feels strong, like actually strong, is Laue. Or Leonhardt. Right? He's the only one that feels strong. Renee is annoying because of, as I said earlier, the instant death she can apply. But that doesn't make her fight difficult, it just makes it tedious because you just have to... everybody die. Oh, I got... Everybody died. Okay, let's go equip some, death-resistant gear. Okay, now the fight's easy, right? Genuinely, that's how Renee is. She's not difficult, she's just gimmicky. Blue Blanc, again, wasn't too difficult. I found Blue Blanc in Cold Steel 2 to be a more difficult fight than Blue Blanc in Sky. And that might just be because of the mechanical differences that could be applied because of the time and also the fact there's another person in that fight. But again, Blue Blanc wasn't too difficult. Luciola was, again, gimmicky, and that was the only reason I found her fight mildly annoying. But as soon as I figured out the gimmick, it was just a normal fight without anything, remotely complicated or difficult at all. It was just beat her until she dies, right? And I'm not talking about her demons, I'm talking about her clones, where if you hit the one that isn't her, your party members get scattered around the screen. That, at first, the first time I did the fight, I didn't realize what that was. I was like, what? And then I was like, huh? And then I got wiped. So I did it again. And then the second time I was like, now I get it. But it's not like it's hard to figure out which one's real, because if you have an information quartz equipped, it tells you which one's real, because the real one's the only one that drops Sepith. So, yeah. The fight isn't difficult if you know what you're doing, or have had equipped the right stuff, So like I said, Laue is the only one that was different. Walter was a complete pushover. Like, yeah, he does a lot of damage, and his S-Craft is a bit threatening, but like, again, he wasn't difficult. It was just, punch him until he dies. That was it. Again, the only one that was difficult was Laue. And he actually feels difficult. He has mechanics that you have to play around, you can't just ignore. He has good damage. The ads, the two guys that he has with him in the fight are actually moderately threatening compared to, the two that Walter has. I mean, the Marionette clowns are annoying in the Blue Blanc fight, but they're not, like, a problem. It's just if you get, you know, an annoying series of status effects applied to you by them, then you'll be like, ugh. But that's all that's really with them. Luciolas, again, the being able to cancel your arts is like the only annoyance, but again, it's not the end of the world, because as soon as you're taking care of the little minis, the fight is really, really easy. I mean, Luciola was the first one I killed in that fight. Well, the randoms were the first things I killed, then Luciola, and then the two big smoke guys. Don't know why I'm telling you this, doesn't matter. Again, I think the game was overall, apart from a certain few annoying fights, really easy. I'm not going to be playing third on a higher difficulty, because I've been told third's really hard. However, having played Cold Steel 2 on hard and planning to play Zero and Azure on Nightmare, yeah, I think these games, the only problem I have with these games, they're a little bit too easy. Especially because I am, if I were to say I'm probably more of a gameplay over story kind of guy, I can ignore a bad story, but I can't ignore bad gameplay, right? And the games being easy, I think, did kind of impact my enjoyment of the games a little bit. Doesn't mean they're bad at all. They're incredible stories, and that brings them up a hell of a lot. Right now, second chapter is my favorite of the 4 games I've played. In order, it would be first chapter, Cold Steel 1, Cold Steel 2, second chapter. That's, as of right now. Just because I found the games easy does not mean I found them bad. It's just, I'd have liked a little bit more challenge on certain boss fights, if I'm being entirely honest. But that's all there really is to it. I could probably have played this game on a high difficulty and I wouldn't have had this complaint. That's all there really is to that. Same probably if I find third easy, or, you know, any of the games easy. Really, it's just play on a high difficulty and then my problem goes away. So it's a nonsense complaint that I just thought I'd voice, just to any of you that are watching at this point and are good at JRPGs, you'll have some sort of insight. But yes, really good game. I really enjoyed the story. Ouroboros, while they weren't threatening to fight, are a really interesting organization. Obviously, I knew kind of about because of playing Cold Steel 1 and 2. Really, really good stuff. I really enjoyed these games. As I said earlier, I would highly, highly recommend you go play the Trails series. And with that out of the way, I've been Animosity, you've been you, and I hope it's time for another video. Ta-ta. For now.